largest passenger ship in the world, but we didn't call her Titanic then.
I was there from the beginning. I watched the shipwrights lay the keel blocks. They set big wooden blocks on the slipway to start with, then the keel atop of it, like a backbone, and the frames attached to that, like a skeleton.
Workshops everywhere. It took weeks to find your way around. There'd be workshops for every trade you ever heard of. Painters, sailmakers, coppersmiths, boiler makers, cabinet makers. I even learned a bit about French polishing off them.
All the roofs was a fine place to work, but dangerous. Every ship cost a life, and there'd be lots of injuries besides.
I was in the engine works for a while. Very well equipped it was. That's where we built the triple expansion engines. 2 of them, each as high as a 3-story house.
I worked in the frame bending shop. You'd heat steel beams in the furnace, then hook them onto slabs of cast iron and hammer them curved. It was skilled work. You had to bend them more than you needed because the frame straightened out a little when it cooled.
The shell plates that made up the hull weighed up to 4.5 tons. They were taller than the da.
The plates were overlapped on the edges. Some were raised, one after another. We called it clincher. One of the foremen taught me years ago. That's how you built steel ships.
I worked as a heater boy. You had to heat the rivets on a wee plate. You pumped the bellows till the rivet was white hot. Then you get a hold of it with your tongs and throw it up to the catcher. And he put it in the hole in the plate for the holder up.
There were 2 of us on the other side of the plate that hold her up. We had to hammer the rivet so it filled the hole before it turned dull red.
The double bottom. That's a wee space we called the tanks, made up of steel plates. The rest of the rivet squad all had to fit into that gap.
One of the 4 men would check each rivet with a special hammer. If it made a ringing sound, we'd have to get back and chase it out after work.
I'd get scared working down in that double bottom. You only had candles for light.
And the constant hammering against the shell plates. You could hear it all over Belfast. Some of those boys ended up stone deaf, so they did. We were paid 31 bob a week. The heater boy and catcher got 16 bob, but we all worked the same 54 hours.
The upper deck was steel too, and part of the strength of the ship. There's no straight lines on a ship, and when you look down the weather deck, you can see the shear of the hull, which stopped her flexing at sea.
The stern frame had to be strong enough to take the rudder turning in heavy seas. You'd have all these timbers and guy wires to steady the frame, and men scurrying around like ants underneath.
When we came to launch day, I was torn between pride and fear. The standing ways were coated in tallow, train oil and soft soap, so the ship would slide when they shifted her weight off the blocks. That was the most dangerous part, when the shipwrights were knocking away the last props. They were under compression, you see, and the sliding ways would be released by the hydraulic trigger.
100,000 people watched the launch. Some paid a bob to sit in the reserved seating. There were extra trams laid on. Then we all went off to the pub to wish her well.
Doc, you were proud to be an island man that day. And Titanic was the pride of Belfast.
Thank you for joining us. The tour will end in a few seconds. Please exit the car carefully and make sure you don't leave any personal possessions behind. When the car has stopped, push the lap bar down and lift up to exit safely. And mind your step as you leave the car. We look forward to seeing you again. Building Titanic was a feat of engineering. Harland and Wolff employed 15,000 men at that time, many of whom worked on Titanic over the 26 months it took to construct the hull for launch. At the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, there was a 6,000-ton structure which was over 200 feet high. It was known as the Aral Gantry. The gantry was constructed to house two massive ships that were being built for the White Star Line. It supported the giant cranes that lifted materials and equipment into the ship's hull using steel and rope slings made on-site by the yard's rigging teams. Housed in the Aral Gantry was a Harland and Wolff ship with the yard number 401. It became known the world over as Titanic, the largest passenger liner in the world. Titanic's construction began with the keel being placed on a series of wooden blocks laid on the slipway. These were made of pitch pine and were stacked about 4 feet high with angled wedges on top. On these were laid the first steel plates. The plates were strengthened on the bottom by a flat slab keel bar, which protected the bottom of the ship. On top of the steel plates, a 6-foot-high solid spine was laid, which ran the length of the ship and was known as the vertical keel. The vertical keel had a rigid rib of plates which ran along its spine. At the base was Titanic's double bottom. Here the hull was made up of 2 layers of steel plates, in some cases forming enclosed tanks and coal bunkers. Along the hull were the steel frames that made up the skeleton of the ship. The frames were curved to give the hull its shape and were positioned between 2 and 3 feet apart. The ship's frames started out as straight bars. These were heated in a furnace, then hooked out onto slabs of cast iron, where they were hammered into the required shape against an iron mold. The frames tended to straighten slightly as they cooled, so the frame benders gave it a little more curve than needed and hammered it into the finished shape before it was too cool to bend. Lowering the frames into place was a dangerous process until they had been firmly joined up by the horizontal girders called stringers, which locked them into position. Then the shell plates that made up the hull were riveted onto the outside. The shell plates on the hull of Titanic were 30 feet long and were laid in 2 ways. At the sides, the shell plates were alternately sunken and raised, known as inner and outer strakes. At the bottom of the hull, the plates were attached using the clinker method, where each plate overlaps the previous. Every plate had to be riveted in place, which was partially mechanized and partially done by hand by riveting squads. The riveters worked in teams of 5. On one side of the plate, the iron rivets were heated on a portable hearth by the heater boy. Using tongs, he threw the rivet to the catch boy, who placed it in the hole for the holder up, who held the head in place with a hammer. On the other side of the plate, 2 men worked with hammers to fit the rivet tightly into a pre-punched hole, then chipped off the surplus material. To make the process quicker, the best teams used one left-handed and one right-handed riveter. They then marked each finished row with chalk. The deck beams were made of steel, which were then plated over to form the decks. The exterior decks were clad in yellow pine and caulked so they remained waterproof. The decks were arched, known as camber, so that any water would run to the channel waterway and drain overboard. The wooden decks were mostly lead and pine and were secured to the steel plating beneath by bolts. The decking ran lengthways parallel to the center line of the ship. At the stern of the ship were massive castings that supported Titanic's rudder and propeller shafts. These were made off-site by the Darlington Forge Company. The center propeller shaft passed through part of the cast that supported the rudder. It was known as the stern frame and was the hinge which allowed the rudder to steer the ship. The outer propellers were held clear of the hull by propeller bosses. The rudder was built of 6 steel sections. The rudder frames had to be enormously strong to withstand the force of the rudder turning in heavy seas.
Size. It not quite